Representative Walsh, you spent several days on the House floor debating and discussing and voting on bills. We just passed cutoff. Can you explain the importance of cutoff and why legislators have been spending so much time on the floor debating and voting on bills?
Every legislative session in Olympia is divided into a couple of pieces, kind of scheduled modules, if you will. And the first is the cutoff. We call it House of Origin cutoff. That is a deadline within the session by which date bills have to be passed off the floor of the chamber that they started in. So either the state house or the state senate. Generally, it's the first major deadline of the session each year. So generally things kind of start out slowly, but then as this first deadline approaches, they get very intense as bills have to be debated and voted on each of the floors by that date. The crunch kind of comes in the week or so before that first cutoff date. And that's what we just finished. We had a week of heavy floor action, lots of debating, lots of voting. And then right toward the end, in the last 48 hours before the first cutoff, the first deadline, we actually pulled a proper all-nighter. We debated one particularly bad bill for more than 9 hours, almost 10 hours, starting a kind of Monday late afternoon, early evening, going all the way through the night to the next Tuesday morning. And that was something that hadn't happened in a long time in Olympia. So it was a new thing to new legislators, and it called back the way things used to be done more often 10, 20 years ago. So that was an intense episode there, and we were making points and having a parliamentary style debate longer than anybody's seen it in a long time.
There were several bad bills that were approved. Can you share some of the bills that have recently been approved that you were a no vote on?
Well, that bill that we debated overnight for almost 10 hours was a particularly nasty bill, and that was the reason we fought so hard on it. That bill was an effort by the governor and some of his supporters in the legislature to undo an initiative, a people's initiative from a number of years ago that had overturned our state of Washington's Department of Labor and Industries, L&I, program to start an ergonomic standard. Ergonomic standard is a standard for workplace safety that deals with soft tissue injuries, things like carpal tunnel syndrome and chronic back agitation and problems. So they're not injuries in the workplace like breaking a bone or dislocating a shoulder. They're more cumulative and sort of chronic health problems that develop. And it's not always clear when these chronic health problems develop where they started, whether they started in the workplace or started at home, started because of somebody's hobby or the avocational sport they play or something like that. They're more cumulative injuries, cumulative physical issues. It's been a hot issue, a hotly debated issue for many years. At the federal level, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, tried to do an ergonomic standard, and it failed. It fell apart, and federal OSHA basically abandoned the project, decided not to do it. So this was an attempt to do the similar at the state level here in the state of Washington. It's a standard that will make employers and workplaces liable under L&I's workers' comp program for these kind of cumulative injuries that are very hard to trace to a workplace. It's hard to say where they came from. So it's a policy that hasn't worked at the federal level, hasn't worked here at the state previously, historically, was the subject of a people's initiative where the people voted to not do this thing. And now the governor and his supporters in the legislature are ignoring the people's voice in that initiative, and they want to push forward an ergonomic rule that will become law that our Department of Labor and Industry will try to enforce in workplaces. It's a bad bill. It's a job-killing bill, and it'll lead to companies leaving the state of Washington in some cases. It'll lead to more automation. It'll lead to more companies replacing humans with robots or automated ordering systems or things like that. So it's something that we very strongly feel is bad for workers, bad for working families, and it doesn't really make anybody safer. It doesn't make workplaces any safer. So we fought that all night long. Now, in the course, that bill did end up passing, by the way, on a very, very narrow, not even partisan line. It was a 1 or 2 vote majority that passed it, and a number of Democrats crossed the line and voted with the Republicans in that case against the bill. And that bill was House Bill 1837.
The Democrats are trying to fix problems from previous years, including law enforcement reforms, and they've put forth reforms to reform the reforms from just last year. One of those bills is House Bill 2037. Can you share why that's a bad bill?
2037 is a bad bill. It's not the worst bill, but it's a somewhat bad bill because it doesn't go far enough. That's basically its problem. What happened was, in the last year or two, the governor and his supporters in the legislature pushed forward a number of bills focused on what they call police reforms. Now, of course, these came out of the wake of the terrible George Floyd incident in Minnesota, where a police officer acted inappropriately and contributed to the death of the fellow George Floyd, a man. And that police officer acted badly, was eventually prosecuted under Minnesota law and convicted. But there was great outrage all around the country about police misconduct and police brutality. So then, starting about 2 years ago here in Olympia, there were a number of police reform bills put forward that attempted to address the issues of police use of force, of how police do pursuits, and other actions that police officers, frontline police officers, take on the streets while enforcing the law. These were well-intended in some cases, very political in other cases, but in all, and it was a group of about a dozen different bills, they pushed the pendulum a little bit too far. That is, they restricted and limited frontline police officers' ability to operate too much. It became too restrictive. And we've been left with a situation here in Washington, which most people have read about or heard about and seen about on TV, where our frontline police officers aren't able to enforce the law effectively. They aren't able to pursue, to chase suspects or criminals. They aren't able to get involved with situations like domestic violence situations, if they get a domestic violence call, or sometimes even crimes in progress at a store, at a retail location, or a shopping mall, or things like this. So what we've tried to do, a big goal of mine and my caucuses this session, has been to try to bring that pendulum back to the middle and calibrate and kind of adjust some of those bills recently passed to bring a little more discretion and ability to operate back to our frontline law enforcement officers. 2037, House Bill 2037, was an attempt to do that. It did a couple of things that help, that allow frontline law enforcement officers to use some reasonable force. They're not as restricted as they were if this bill becomes law. Particularly, it's focused on a frontline officer's ability to use force to restrain and possibly arrest and detain uh, someone who's in the midst of a mental health crisis. I mean, a mental breakdown, nervous breakdown, losing it in the street, on the sidewalk, in a public place. It gives the officer a little bit more ability to detain that person, restrain or detain that person, using good judgment and using a reasonable amount of force to do so. So that's okay. But it just doesn't go far enough. We need more discretion returned to law enforcement officers so that they can use reasonable force to de-escalate violent situations or situations that are about to get violent, uh, and use their training, which they are trained to do, to kind of cool down and de-escalate those kinds of situations. So 2037 doesn't go far enough. We tended to support 2037 on our side, but we gave our support with as a sort of sign of good faith and hope that the governor and the speaker and their supporters would approve some of our bills so that together we would have a couple of pieces that would be a combined reform of the reforms that would really get us back to a good place in terms of what law enforcement can do in Washington. We haven't gotten there yet. And so we're a little frustrated at this. We supported the governor's and the speaker's bill 2037. They did not reciprocate and support our bill, one in particular, which would have returned some of the ability of police to pursue, to give chase to suspects or criminals. And there's still time. We might be able to work something out, but at this moment, we're not happy. We thought that we offered a hand of good faith to the governor and his supporters, and they did not return. So that's why 2037 is frustrating.
Can you share some of the top bad bills that you saw get approved on the House floor recently?
We had a bill that had to do with nurse staffing at hospitals and medical clinics around the state. That was House Bill 1868. And, I've been talking very closely, very often with the nurses in the 19th Legislative District, particularly in the Longview and Aberdeen Hoquiam areas. And they've been through a lot. They've had to deal not only with nursing through the COVID outbreaks, but they've had to deal with some very unpopular mandates and edicts affecting how they work, and in some cases, if they can work at all. This bill, 1868, isn't good for the smaller rural hospitals that are the hospitals in the 19th District. It mandates a certain minimal level of nurse staffing at hospitals and puts limits on the hours and the amount of overtime, and it requires specific kinds of breaks that nurses must take in a way that really requires, frankly, more personnel, more nurses on the floor of the hospital. And it's easy to understand what the intent here is. It's to make sure that hospitals are properly staffed, but it doesn't take into account the particular operating requirements, the operating realities of rural hospitals, of your smaller hospitals. And these hospitals are recognized both in federal law and state law as a different breed than larger urban or suburban hospitals. They're compensated through Medicare and Medicaid differently. They're treated differently in most ways than your larger hospitals. But this bill, proposed law, 1868, doesn't make that distinction. It treats small rural hospitals the same as it treats one of your big hospitals in downtown Seattle or in Tacoma or Spokane or one of the state's larger cities. And for that reason, we were opposed to the bill, all of us from the rural parts of the state. And we tried to get it so that it would recognize the different needs of rural hospitals and give them a little more flexibility and grace on this issue. And the speaker and her supporters refused to take those suggestions. So While 1868 does attempt to do some good things in terms of recognizing the stress and the amount of work that nurses have been under, it's a financial and economic unreality for rural hospitals, some of which may have to shut wings down and wards down because they can't staff them properly. And that's a perverse effect. That's going to end up having fewer healthcare options available to people in rural Washington. And it's going to be more ambulance rides and more nervous car rides from places like Elma, places like Ocean Shores, places like Westport, into the urban or suburban areas where your larger hospitals are. I'm sure that's not what the makers of the bill intended, but that's what's going to happen. And we're going to probably have to come back and fix this bill at some future point because it's not practical and it's going to end up hurting rural hospitals.
Representative Walsh, you have a legislative briefing once a week. Can you share some details on that and how people can sign up to participate?
Yes, during this session, we've started something new. Every Saturday at 4 p.m., I'm doing a Zoom town hall. So it's an online town hall meeting where people from the 19th district, really anywhere, can sign on. And it's much like this format, a little give and take on video, but it's live. So I'll take questions from people and answer to the best of my ability what they want to know about what's going on here in Olympia. Those are Saturdays at 4 p.m. You can sign up. You have to register to participate in it because it gives you an internet link that you click on to join the town hall. You can go to my website, which is representativejimwalsh.com. Spell it out in one long line, Representative Jim Walsh. You can also contact me through email, and that's jim.walsh@leg.wa.gov, G-O-V. Or you can call my office, which is 360-786-7806. And just say you are interested in signing up for the online town hall. They're every Saturday. You don't have to click in every Saturday, but if you're available, have the time and want to, you can. They last about an hour. And it's basically an update on what's been going on in Olympia that previous week and what we're looking forward to in the week ahead. It's been pretty successful so far. We're still kind of building on it, and we're doing it during this legislative session, and then afterward we'll see what happens. Maybe we may continue to do them, or it may be something we just do during the legislative sessions. But either way, it's a good way to get in touch. It's a good way to get informed. And I would welcome you to join us Saturdays at 4 p.m.